Hey there, this is Tom with the Diogenes Lamp podcast. I appreciate you listening in, and most importantly, I hope you enjoy what you hear. Before we start with today's episode, I'm going to ask you for a small favor. Believe it or not, history podcasts, especially in their early stages, tend not to be cash cows. Shocker, I know. I too was blindsided by this news. Now, I didn't go into this for the money. I think that much is obvious. But unfortunately, books, research materials, and equipment aren't free. Please, go to patreon.com/Diogenes Lamp Podcast, and for less than the price of a coffee once a month, you can become a member and get access to bonus episodes, recommended reading lists and documentaries, shout-outs, and anything else we'll offer in the future as this project grows. If you are especially broke, hey, I get it, but please, make sure to give us a 5-star review when you listen to us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to the pod on your preferred podcast listening medium. Your support is appreciated, and more importantly, it is needed in order to keep this operation going. On that note, I hope you have a great day, and now back to the show. All the forms of government have many and great deficiencies, and it follows that even democracy has great deficiencies. And in the term democracy, we must include royal as well as republican democracy. But all reasonable men have long ago recognized that democracy has less drawbacks than monarchy and oligarchy. Democracy brings to the political service, and thus to power, the most capable men, provided only that they have a temperament apt for struggle. We have proof of this even in Greece, where the political leaders revealed by our royal democracy, Trikoupis, Theodorzaïmis, Delianis, Theotokis, Rallis, were undoubtedly the best of their period for the government of Greece. Gounaris was revealed and imposed much more by the king trampling on the constitution than by the popular vote. The elections of November 1st were certainly a colossal error of the people, but what people has not made colossal errors in its history? Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Diogenes Lamp Podcast, episode number 23, Bread, Olives, and King Constantine, Greek Monarchism, Part 6. And that was a quote by none other than the Venizelos. It was actually a letter specifically to Plastiras that he had written, pretty much kind of like shaking off the idea, or trying to dissuade Plastiras and the rest of his crew from setting up a dictatorship. Because we are approaching, the Revolutionary Committee, right? And the coup post-Asia Minor. And we also are approaching something else today, the execution of the Six. So let's take off where we left off last, from where we left off last. Two big signals just to touch base again, right? First big announcement, ministers arrested would be tried via special court-martial, not in civil court. That's a big deal. And then additionally, Prince Andrew, King Constantine's younger brother, and Yorgos Baltazis, who was foreign minister of the Gounaris government, were also both arrested. And really those signals, those changes, let's say, are harbingers of what's to come. And these signals, as you can imagine, set off alarm bells to the British, and Ambassador Lindley sent the foreign minister of this puppet government, Politis, the new puppet government of Greece, an official warning. And by mid-November, the British threatened, albeit in a bit of an obscure manner, the British manner, right, that if they did not receive assurances that those arrested wouldn't be executed, the protecting powers would invoke their positions as protecting powers of the Greek state, something that goes all the way back to the founding of the Greek state, where the British, French, and Russians had legal power to use force in certain circumstances, if that makes sense. It's complicated, but we can talk more about it later, and I'm sure we will. This sent Politis running back and forth trying to find a solution. One that was pushed forward was that what if the British could help enforce exile from Greece for those arrested? The proposal was sent to Lord Curzon, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time, and the proposal was accepted. But too bad it didn't matter, right? Because by the time the British accepted this proposal, General Pangalos had already concluded his findings, which he presented to the court-martial. Gounaris, Prime Minister, Theotokis, War Minister, Protopapadakis, Finance Minister, and Prime Minister in a royalist coalition government that ruled for a bit during the campaign, Stratos, Interior Minister, and Goudas, who was Interior Minister for a bit and had a couple other positions during the Asia Minor campaign, Baltazis, Foreign Minister, like we mentioned earlier, and General Hadjianestis were all accused of high treason. Generally speaking, not a good thing to be accused of in 1920s Greece if your goal is trying not to be executed. Right? Treason, the punishment for treason in history has traditionally always been execution, Greece or not. It's quite common, right? So, yeah, not great if you're one of those 6 guys, obviously. Let's get a glimpse of some of the specific reasons or how they were brought to this charge of treason. And quote, in having voluntarily and by design permitted the incursion of foreign troops of the Turkish National Army into the territory of the kingdom in the region of Asia Minor occupied by Greece, adjudged to her by the Treaty of Severus, and in having delivered to the enemy towns, fortresses, a great part of the army and material of war of great value. In more detailed charges, the court mentioned other specific reasons for the charge, like ignoring warnings about how the return of the king would damage relations with the great powers, about having failed to annex northern Epirus, which is in today's southern Albania, and the Dodecanese Islands, which Greece wouldn't get back till 1947 after World War II, of swapping out Venizelist officers, of failing to advise the king to abdicate, of still ordering the Ankara offensive in the summer of 1921, despite not being prepared, of wasting the country's money, of appointing General Hadjianestis as commander-in-chief, who was, quote, well known to everyone, including yourself, as an unbalanced element, which I think is fucking hilarious way to call someone who's absolutely off their rocker. If you ever want to call someone in a nice way batshit crazy, you can call them an unbalanced element going forward. And, of course, remember, we're talking about the guy who thought his legs were made of sugar, Hadjianestis. Lastly, the 6 were also accused of, charged with inventing AIDS, cancer, and for not guarding Big Shot Rob in the 2005 NBA Finals. Oh, shit. That last one was actually Rasheed Wallace's fault. I'm sorry. Should have had 2 rings, Pistons, but whatever. Either way, the 6 clearly invented AIDS and cancer as well. We all know that, so they were also had that on the charges. You guys get the joke, right? These guys are being charged with a lot of shit, and these people clearly want them dead, right? In late November, a formal trial of sorts did continue, but Gounaris came down with typhus halfway through and had to step away from it all. Also, there was a certain rush to it all, right? To the whole situation, probably to beat any British response. Right. Finally, on November 28th at 6:30 a.m., General Othoneos, who was president of the court-martial, entered the courtroom and read the verdict. All 8 of the accused were found guilty of high treason. Gounaris, Stratos, Protopapadakis, Baltazis, Theotokis, and Hadjianestis were all sentenced to death, so 6 out of the 8. Stratigos and Goudas to life imprisonment. So those 2 guys got spared their lives. Gounaris, meantime, was still in bed sick in a hospital, where at approximately the same time the verdict was being read, an officer told Gounaris to get up and come to the Avarov prison. We know generally how the rest of the story goes, right? The 6 give their farewells to wives and children. Gounaris writes a will. A priest comes and gives them their last sacrament, and by 10:30 a.m., they are told to say goodbye to their loved ones who are still visiting them in prison. The 6, as they will become to be known, are taken to the Goudi barracks, the same site of the 1909 Goudi coup, and are shot via firing squad. There are no actual pictures of the execution because no journalists or people were allowed in or cameras. But we have some firsthand accounts and other descriptions from people that spoke to those who were there. So as you can imagine, guys, this is as dramatic as it can get. This is crazy dramatic. So let's, buckle up or whatever, right? Apparently, when Nicolaus Stratos was helping Gunaris, the prime minister, out of the truck that helped bring him to Ludi, where they were going to get executed, Gunaris, probably due to being a bit dazed because he was sick with typhus, remember, asked, "Where are we going?" To which Stratos replied, and quote, "To the other world." Oh my God. General Hadzi had also been sentenced, right, with degradation, which is like where they remove your insignia and rank as a general or whatever. Sources are fuzzy on this, like whether you read from Michael Llewelyn-Smith or whether you read from Andre Gerolymatos. But depending, what you read, his last words were either something like, "My only shame is that I commanded an army of deserters," and quote, that's something you'll find a lot. And what he's doing by saying that is he pretty much blamed the individual soldiers for the fiasco, which is obviously unfair, or something like, or another quote that you'll hear, depending on the source, was something along the lines of, "I was a fugitive commander-in-chief." I assume referring to his current state as an ex-commander-in-chief. So that's the famous Hadzi Nesti, the guy with glass legs, right? When it came time for his degradation, which, by the way, again, there are conflicting reports as to this next part, he refused anyone to touch him and tore off his own, medals and stuff and threw them to the ground himself. An officer with a sword escorted the six to their spots, which had a hole dug for them to fall into for their big sleep, let's call it. But even so, with death staring at them through the barrel of a rifle, the six still stood defiant. Hadzi Nestis, his legs no longer made of sugar or glass or whatever, stood attentively. The foreign minister Baltazis put on his monocle. Gunaris, even in sickness, focused his sight at the firing squad after Protopapadakis helped him to his spot. Shortly after they had taken their spots with their shallow graves behind them, 6 firing squads of 5 men each presented arms. But the officer in charge noticed something was a little off. One of the squads had 6 men, not 5. The officer in charge ordered the rogue soldier to step aside, but the soldier, obstinate, refused. This led to rumblings that this 6th rogue soldier was a veteran of the Asia Minor campaign and wanted to take his revenge on the supposed guilty. Shortly after this drama unfolded, Colonel Neokosmos Grigoriadis, a well-known and loyal Venizelist, started reading the charges of the condemned, but as he was reading, his voice started to fail him. He made a few more attempts to proceed, but ended up fainting, hitting the cold, wet ground. Another colonel, who was the secretary of the court-martial, immediately snatched the paper from his still unconscious colleague's hands and finished reading the sentencing. The 6 were given the standard option of any last words, to which all 6 refused. They were also offered blindfolds so as not to see the method of their own executions, to which all 6 refused. And, if you believe this couldn't get any more surreal, just keep following along with us, guys. At this point, as with any execution via firing squad, you generally speaking need someone to yell, aim, and fire. This task was assigned to a veteran who had lost his leg in the Asia Minor campaign. The vet, struggling with his crutches, slowly but surely made his way to the firing squad. But now the only sound was a priest saying a final prayer, and then the moment came. The amputee yelled, "Aim," then "Fire," and 31 rifles exploded. 5 of the 6 dropped immediately, but the man with the glass legs, General Hadzi Nesti, staggered, and while clutching his throat, spun around downward towards the ground, grabbing his throat and grasping for air. Now, usually, there is some head officer in these circumstances to give a mercy shot to anyone who didn't die immediately. After all, it's an execution, not a torture session, right? But before the head officer in charge could do so, that rogue soldier we mentioned earlier, not the one in crutches, the 31st guy I'm talking about, the one who people thought might have been a veteran of the Asia Minor campaign, dropped to one knee, took aim, and blew Hadzi Nestis' head open. And yes, first-hand accounts do note there was blood and brains were spattered splattered everywhere. Even something General Lambros Space, a member of the Revolutionary Committee, apparently stayed traumatized by for a long time, as he later passed on to historian Marquezinis. A grisly affair, to say the least, right? The officer in charge made his final round, and 5 more shots shattered the silence. 1 shot for each of the remaining of the 6's heads. But as we know, there were more than just 6 that were charged with high treason and other stuff, right? Michael Gudas, like we said, got life imprisonment, but in reality would serve very little of that term. And the military commander Xenophon Strategos, a commander in the Asia Minor campaign, also received life imprisonment and military degradation. But as we know, Greek politics is constantly changing. So Strategos got amnesty in 1924, where he left for Switzerland shortly after to get treatment for tuberculosis. And he ended up dying later, like 3 years later in March of 1927. Anyways, those 2 were little fish when compared to Prince Andrew, right? Who was a royal. We mentioned earlier, he was a little brother to King Constantine and a commander in the 1921 summer campaign. Instead of execution, he was deemed guilty of insubordination and received degradation and banishment. Under British pressure, Plastiras considered that in any case, any instance, any death sentence passed down to the royal would be changed to life banishment, which is what he was ultimately charged with. He would end up leaving for his second exile on the British warship, the HMS Calypso, with his wife and the future Prince Philip. And the future Prince Philip, by the way, guys, that's the guy who was the husband of Queen Elizabeth, the really old lady who died, like, kind of recently or whatever, right? British royalty. If you watch the show The Crown, I know I've mentioned this before so many times, but if you watch the show The Crown, you know, he's like the main character next to Queen Elizabeth, which is a great show. Just a couple months later, on January 11th of 1923, King Constantine would die in Palermo, Sicily, of heart failure at the age of 54. And so ended the reign of King Constantine, the first of Greece. Upon the abdication and exile of King Constantine, King George II was put on the throne in September of 1922 after the coup by Plastiras and friends, but before the execution of the 6. Let's get to know the new king a little better, everyone. King George II was born in 1890, studied at the Beaton school and also in Berlin with the Prussian Guard, and graduated at 19 years old. Metaxas, as we know, a trusted aide and ally of the royalists, was 19 years older than the young prince, and helped to provide him the proper training any future king should receive. For any of my Dune fans, think of Paul Atreides and Gurney Halleck, okay? George served in the Balkan Wars and took part in the capture of Thessaloniki, a hell of an experience to have at the young age of 22 or so. When his father was assassinated, he became officially the crown prince. As World War I came, and the Novembriana along with it, as we know, George stood by his father's side and was exiled with him and the rest of the royal family in 1917, while his brother Alexander took the throne. During the Asia Minor campaign, George serves in Asia Minor just like other royals, and then catastrophe hits where King Alexander's dog tries to eat a monkey. The king says, please not today, and is bitten and dies a couple weeks later or whatever, and you already know that, obviously. King George II is known by as many as having a much colder character than his siblings, smiling rarely, being more aloof than many by Greek standards. He was just more cold and kind of like more German in the way he acted. That's the new king in a nutshell. We know the king already, of course, from previous episodes, especially during his role in the 4th of August regime. So let's rewind it a bit. Immediately after the coup, King George II is put on the throne, and it's kind of a wait-and-see situation, as the Republicans are not completely united on what to do, right? Like, they just overthrew the government and executed 6 monarchists and banished Prince Alexander, right? So hardliners, of course, are calling for the full expulsion of the monarchy and the abolition of that institution as a whole. But there were others who were taking a more wait-and-see approach, perhaps weighing options and pros and cons of what to do or what not to do. But they wouldn't need to ponder about what to do for too long, because in late October of 1923, there is a coup. Imagine that, people, another coup. It's really unbelievable, I know. So, there's like another coup, which is known as the Llewelyn-Smith Gargalidis coup, or if that's too much of a mouthful, you can just say the October coup of 1923. And before we get into this, I want to say there's a very limited amount of English sources on this. In fact, I could only find one. Shout out to historian Terry Stavridis, way down there in the land down under in Australia, for researching this, especially in each part of modern Greek history. Between that source and torturing my wife to help me translate an article I found in Greek, I was able to get a grasp of like the gist of what this coup is all about. I think Veremis has some stuff too in that one book, that one little book, but I don't know. I'll post it if I find anything else. So let's talk briefly about the October coup of 1923, not to be confused with the November coup of 1924, which, like this one, ended in failure. So, on October 22nd, 1923, Venizelos generals Leonardopoulos and Gargalidis and a royalist colonel, George Ziras, started a coup against the Revolutionary Committee, right? Plastiras and Pangalos and those guys. Now, we've seen many coups so far in our story, but there haven't been that many with Venizelists and monarchists working together, right? Never say never, but it is pretty interesting that it's kind of across the aisle, right? Royalists and Venizelists. But, why is this the case, right? Why? Kind of weird, right? Again, getting sources on this wasn't the easiest, but in a nutshell, the Venizelos generals were pissed due to being sidelined and relegated by the Revolutionary Committee, and the Royalists, Colonel Ziras most notably, was nervous that if elections were held, it would result in the complete abolishment of the monarchy. I know it's confusing, so let's add some more context to all of this. As we know, the Revolutionary Committee took charge after the Asia Minor disaster, had the trial of the six, shot them, yada, yada, yada. Okay, but just because the six were dead, there was still an entire Kemalist Turkish army ready to march on Western Thrace and Macedonia. In this Revolutionary Committee, you had more hardliners in regards of what to do on the military front. At this point, the Greek army had been reorganized and had been restored. There would be no more retreat en route like there was at Sakarya. These hardliners were led by people like Pangalos and Plastiras, who believed that with this newly constituted army, they could reach the Dardanelles Straits in 10 days. That's actually a quote, or that's actually what Plastiras believed and was cited as having said. What happened was in July of 1923, General Othonios founded the, quote, Army League, which looked to replace the Revolutionary Committee, with the goal of having a republic. We know General Othonios from earlier as he was the president of the court-martial at the trial of the Sixth. Anyways, that's the context of what's going on at the time of the Leonardopoulos Gargalidis coup in October of 1923. So without getting too much into it, the coup failed, with people like Kondylis, Plastiras, and Pangalos all playing pivotal roles that led to the surrendering of rebel formations in northern and southern Greece. Metaxas at the time was touring the Peloponnese, campaigning for an upcoming election, but his tour quickly turned into him being on the lam, being a fugitive. And that's because while it is debated how much Metaxas was really involved in this coup, it's generally agreed that he was involved in this coup. As Metaxas was being pursued by government forces in the Peloponnese, he wrote in his diary, quote, I think of flight, escape. And on October 27th in Corinth, he jumped on a boat with his wife where he went into his second exile in Italy. Second exile, right? The royalist Colonel Ziras ended up fleeing to Bulgaria. Another royalist general we all know too well, Papagos, was dismissed for his involvement. And the Venizelos generals Leonardopoulos and Gargalidis were captured and sentenced to death and degradation, just like General Hadzianastis was at the trial of the Six. But, unlike Hadzianastis, they will be spared the death sentence due to appeals from more moderate Venizelists to Plastiras, and even an appeal from Pope Pius IX. These two guys will have their rank restored, by the way, after the 1935 Kondylis-led coup that brings back the king. With that being said, there were a lot of moderate Venizelists who were pissed and now had a reason to really hammer home to Plastiras that the monarchy needs to be abolished, and now. Generals like Othonios, Papanastasiou, Pangalos, obviously Pangalos, right, of course, and Haji Kyriakos and Kondylis all pushed hard for the removal of the king and the establishment of a republic. And on December 16, 1923, elections were held, liberal and pro-Venizelos parties won in a landslide, in big part due to the boycott of anti-Venizelos parties. And 2 days later, King George II would depart from Greece, avoiding physical dethronement by the army. He was first exiled to Romania, and this is because his wife was the daughter of the King and Queen of Romania, so King George II of Greece was son-in-law to the King and Queen of Romania. Additionally, King George was brother-in-law or sister-in-law was the Queen of Yugoslavia, Queen Maria. So, like, these royals are all connected. Anyways, King George stays in Romania for a while, and then his marriage goes to hell in a handbasket, apparently because his wife was sleeping with other married men, yada, yada, yada. And later he moves to England, and eventually they get a divorce in 1935. But just because the king was gone, this will not magically unite Greece. In fact, as we know, this interwar period will be riddled with coups, just so many coups between Republicans and liberals and Venizelists and Republicans, and yada, yada, yada. You get the idea, right? So that's the interwar period, and it is complicated, and we're going to skip over it. So fast forward to 1935, and again, you guys already know what happens next, but if you don't, we'll recap what we already covered in Primer Part 4. Context, again, there's failed Venizelos and Republican coups in 1933 and 1935. These result in massive purges implemented by the anti-Venizelists, which result in Plastiras and Venizelos fleeing in exile in France. While large forces were mobilized, only 4 or so soldiers and civilians were killed, so overall pretty bloodless coup. The response, though, would prove to be a little more than bloodless when compared to past debacles. 2 officers chose suicide, 3 others were court-martialed and then executed, and all in all, some 60 or so were sentenced to death, of which 55 of those sentenced, Venizelos and Plastiras included, left Greece. One of those generals who was sentenced to death was Papoulas. I think I said this last episode, right? But he was a royalist general who was commander-in-chief of the Asia Minor campaign before General Hadzianestis took over. Remember, Hadzianestis, glass legs guy, yada, yada. So, I mean, just like Kondilis had changed sides, so had Papoulas. Many others were given either light sentences or life imprisonment. Martial law would not be lifted until May of that year. Tsaldaris, remember the leader of the Popular Party, which was anti-Venizelos, was coming under heavy pressure from politicians and senior military leaders alike to bring back the king. But he refused. And in response to his refusal, in October of 1935, a coup coming from within the Popular Party, primarily led by General Kondilis, but also aided by other monarchist generals like Papagos, Platis, and Repas, brought down the Tsaldaris government, and a rigged referendum was held in November to bring back the king. There's a lot of reasons why you could call it rigged, but the biggest is it produced a 97% yes vote for the king. After 11 years in exile, King George II was back, but this time without his wife, who had filed for a divorce earlier that year. So upon arrival of the king in November, a new government was created, and a law professor, Constantinos Demerdzis, a member of Metaxas' small and relatively insignificant Eleftherophrones, or Freethinkers Party, was chosen to head it. And believe it or not, elections were held in January of 1936. Like I said earlier, just because the king is back, it doesn't necessarily mean an outright dictatorship, and historically Greece often hovered between a constitutional monarchy and a republic. So this time the political pendulum had swung back to constitutional monarchy. King George called this PR move of his a crowned democracy, which was apparently strongly encouraged by the British, before we give the king too much credit, right? Again, a lot of this is already in Primer Part 4, so please just go give that a listen if you want. But let's just skim over what happens next, the next series of events, which really, to sum it up, are just that everyone dies. That's it. Everyone dies. Kondilis dies, Demerdzis, the prime minister, dies, Tsaldaris, the leader of the opposition, dies, and, not possibly most importantly, Venizelos dies, right? The man, the myth, the legend. They all die within a year of each other. These deaths paved the way for Metaxas, who was appointed prime minister by the king the same day the prime minister died, Demerdzis. By the way, also, Metaxas was minister of war at the time, which was a position he actually took from Papagos. Remember, Papagos was the general in charge of World War II, the defense of Greece, and victory against the Italians. So this is a position he took from Papalos after Papalos had been fired earlier that year when he gave a hard line to the king and also Metaxas about not allowing communists in parliament. Which, if that's confusing, remember that Greece doesn't have a genuine bicameral legislature. In other words, you can be a member of parliament and a minister of war or interior or, foreign minister or whatever, right? Which also makes the U.S. system quite unique, that we have a genuine bicameral legislature, something I actually heard one time when I had the pleasure of meeting Justice Scalia before he died, not because I especially like Justice Scalia. I was at an event and he showed up. He continued to insult multiple people who were there, which was kind of funny. And then, but he dropped that fact. So thank you, Justice Scalia, for that fun fact. Anyways, on July 23rd, 1936, Metaxas had told a couple of his closer associates that the king had given him carte blanche to establish a dictatorship within 10 to 15 days. It's speculated that the king gave Metaxas this power, not just because he trusted Metaxas and because many knew of the competence of Metaxas. I mean, it was Metaxas, right? But also, he needed a strong man to counter any scheming the parliament was up to, something that he was worried about. And don't forget about the communist threat. Again, people were nervous about that. Which takes us back once again to the 4th of August regime. Now, we aren't going all over that again. I think I set aside enough for us in earlier episodes, but I do want to point out a couple of things I didn't in those episodes, specifically the relationship between King George and Metaxas. And by relationship, I don't mean how much they liked each other. I mean their symbiotic association or their symbiotic relationship, right? So let's get into it. As we know, or maybe we forgot, it was King George who signed off on a royal decree suspending articles of the Constitution, and together Metaxas ruled with the king, really making it like a triumvirate, rule by two, if you will. The king needed Metaxas for his political, military, and organizational savviness and heavy-handedness, and Metaxas wanted the king to be, and quote, a symbol and guarantee of national unity, end quote, from Metaxas. With that being said, and if you listen to the 4th of August regime episode, you would know that the new regime was a product of the vision and dream of Metaxas. It was Metaxas who was the chief of all Greeks, the leader, the first athlete, the first peasant, yada, 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 right? It was Metaxas whose picture was everywhere, who created the youth movements, his personal pride, the Ion, which was in essence a paramilitary youth organization loyal to Metaxas, which, remember, had reached a membership of 1 million people at its peak. So yeah, by many accounts, Ion could have made the king nervous. And there are some sources alluding or pointing to this. Because, he has a paramilitary youth organization that's loyal to him and him alone. And Ion was just one of the many creations of Metaxas that was creating a rift of sorts between him and the king. His other creations were entire parallel ministries and departments that were loyal and subservient to Metaxas exclusively, which were staffed with, you guessed it, Metaxists, which, just like you have royalists or Venizelos or communists or fascists or whatever, we now have Metaxists. So yeah, parallel ministries were created, and royalists were replaced with Metaxas. Ministries like the Ministry of Security headed by Maniadakis, which you guys are going to learn about Maniadakis soon enough. Think of him like Metaxas' pit bull, who he will sick on you if you don't step in line, right? He's the guy who's going to play a pivotal role in breaking up the communists during the 4th of August regime, totally picking them apart, torturing, breaking apart their organizations, infiltration, just total pit bull, this guy, Maniadakis, right? Then we have the Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Theologos Nikoloudis, who was known as the Greek Goebbels. Talking about Joseph Goebbels, we're talking about from Nazi Germany. So, Metaxas had his own crew that were loyal to him, is what I'm getting at with all this. Additionally, according to the British Foreign Office, roughly 10% of the value of all German arms trade to Greece went directly to Metaxas, which he was using to strengthen Ion, his parallel ministries, propaganda campaigns, and whatever other projects he was into. And I mean, all of this stuff aside, it was Metaxas who was giving speeches to the people. Metaxas who was creating and announcing new policy initiatives. Metaxas who was driving the rearmament program, announcing Social Security, the 8-hour workday, and all these new and forward-thinking policies. Not the king. It was Metaxas who was driving all these things, right? And another thing to keep in mind, we remember Metaxas for saying ohi or no to the Italians and the Axis powers. Keep in mind that, right? You don't remember King George II. You remember Metaxas. So yeah. Anyways, so all of this stuff, these weren't the only factors that were creating rifts between the two rulers. The other big factor was, of course, foreign policy. As we talked about in previous episodes, Metaxas has that Germanophile charge that everyone kind of accuses him of being. And even to this day, it still follows Metaxas. He's often known as being a bit of a Germanophile. And while it's mostly discredited due to his, actions, right? It's not to say that Metaxas wasn't engaging with Germany and the Nazis. We know Germany was a major trading partner of Greece. And we also know Germany was a key supplier and player in Greece's massive rearmament program. This is no secret, but these facts did make the British and the Americans worried and pissed off. From sources I've read, the consensus is that Metaxas was playing both sides to get the best deal he could and avoid war. But we're approaching this from hindsight today, right? At the time, this wasn't so obvious. A German consul in Thessaloniki noted in January of 1939 that, and quote, the former, as in the king he's referring to, is described as English, while the latter is sympathetically inclined towards the Axis countries. Which, by the way, if you didn't catch what that quote was talking about, they were saying that the king is firmly pro-British. Metaxas is sympathetic to us, right? That's what they're referring to. Whether he was or not, that's what the German consul in Thessaloniki had noted, okay? By 1938, Metaxas had solidified his rule and was securely in charge. So much so that he had his ambassador to Germany pass on to Goebbels that, and quote, foreign policy is the exclusive responsibility of the government and not of the crown. Pretty straightforward, right? In other words, he's saying, listen, foreign policy is my thing. Don't worry about King George II. And as we'll see, these diplomatic maneuverings of Metaxas, combined with him superseding the power of the pro-British King George II, will really paint him in a negative light. It will make the British suspicious of him, of course, but the Americans also will start to seriously question Metaxas's true motives and plans, with the American ambassador McVeigh referring to Metaxas as the king's, and quote, fascist Frankenstein, and quote, also calling him a monster. But even with all of this dance of neutrality that Metaxas was trying to do, ultimately the British would be the only viable final choice. And Metaxas knew this too. Given the realities at the time, it was quite obvious. And this is mostly solidified as we get into 1939 and 1940 when British trade starts to pick up a tiny bit and security guarantees are acquired. From here, we take a bit of a leap, and after Crete fell, the king, Prime Minister Tsouderos, and the rest of the government fled to Egypt in 1941, and then eventually the king and the government in exile will be relocated to London. So let's zoom in on the Greek government in exile in London and just talk a bit about the dynamics of legitimacy, let's call it. So, as we already said, King George II was chilling in London, where he already had many connections from the past when he lived there. We also know that Metaxas died in January of 1941. These two facts, being stationed in London and Metaxas dying in January of 1941, are important when it comes to the legitimacy of the king. One, because King George staying in London physically isolated him from Greece. And what I mean by that is that many Greeks that fled Greece either made their way through Turkey to the Middle East or went through the Mediterranean on their way to Cyprus and then to Egypt, or just to Egypt if they could get there. If the king was in Egypt, then he could have had more contact with actual Greeks who could have told him the real feelings and the real situation of the average Joes on the ground in Athens and elsewhere. But instead, he would receive a filtered, censored, and adulterated newsfeed of events going on in Greece, going through the British, right? Point number 2 I want to get at, when Metaxas died, there was a chance, then and there, to end the 4th of August regime, which again was largely tolerated but not loved by many. In sum, he had a chance to distance himself from the dictatorship and possibly win some real legitimacy and brownie points with the public, especially given this is right after the great win over Mussolini. But instead, the king surrounded himself with other Metaxas, other ministers who were Metaxas and stuff like that, who were left over from the 4th of August regime dictatorship. Okay. As we'll see, the king being out of touch with what the people actually want will be a recurring theme throughout all of this and throughout the Civil War. Luckily, the king will formally abolish the 4th of August regime, but this won't happen until February of 1942, so over a year after Metaxas died, and then like 10 months or so after the Nazis had physically killed the 4th of August regime, like as a state, right? Literally taking over Greece. Either way, this action was done a tad bit too late to help garner any much needed legitimacy. The Constitution of 1911 was reestablished, and the king continued to govern from abroad. As we'll see, as the occupation gets underway and the who's who of resistance groups and forces comes into the play, the monarchists will largely be absent. Why? There seemed to be a consensus among the monarchists and a decent amount of the former political and military elite in general that the fighting had been done already, and thus they had already put their time in, and that it was best to leave this business to the actual armies now, not guerrilla bands in the mountains and stuff like that. And the biggest turnoff of mass resistance to the established political elites was knowing what such resistance would bring, which of course would be, as we're going to see, mass reprisals and mass destruction, obviously. And with that, I think we're mostly caught up to speed and where we need to be in regards to the royals as a political force going into the Civil War. If you think there are some topics you missed, please go back, listen to episodes like 8 through 12-ish to get a better idea of the general atmosphere of everything, or just like anything else that you think you forgot. But that's it for today. Join us next time as we meet another one of the significant forces that will participate in the Greek Civil War, who we're going to be seeing a lot of and are really one of the main characters going forward, that being the communists, the Reds. So that'll be an exciting episode. Take care, everyone. Have a great night. Talk to you soon.